All right, trying this again. About to come out of pocket on ya. Uh, is that too many people lying about this book because of all the millennialism, and so this millennialism started several hundred years ago after the Reformation, when Calvin kind of went the same direction as the Old Testament. Well, guess what? The Old Testament was all Israel only, except for maybe a couple verses in the middle of Psalm, maybe a couple verses in the second two thirds of Isaiah, and so on and so forth. And then the ones in Psalm, and a little bit like Isaiah, a little less so. The way that the Gentiles would come to the truth wasn't really on the equal playing field. And so, to rectify all that, what the New Testament do? They didn't dismiss that or reject that. Like when you go to court, you don't say no, 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 no. You address what they're saying, and you know bounce back or clap back about that. Now, so I wanted to read this thing. So I was reading this book on millennialism. It says, prophets proclaim that an idealized Davidic king would come to restore the monarchy. The future Davidic king was often understood to deliver Israel from the wicked Gentile nations and inaugurate a period of prosperity with other nations subject to Israel. A period of sin and political instability would precede the arrival of the Davidic king, a representative Davidic oracle in Isaiah. So this Davidic king, a lot of people look in the future, but I mean, not even Jesus. You could look even before Jesus. That even Jesus was early to some people, but you could even look before that. There's Zerubbabel and Yehoshua in the book of Zechariah, were the Davidic Messiah. So when you have all these promises of this Messiah coming through, well, you have multiple messiahs because, especially among the Sadducees, they had the Aaronic Messiah, and some folk had the um, the Joseph Messiah, because Joseph, well, guess what? He was dealing with the nations in a sense, because to these strict racialists that Israel was supposed to be a pure bloodline, so they got it all twisted. So anytime in the Bible where somebody's a Gentile, that they're just an Israelite living like a Gentile, because if it's talking about them, they must be Israel because it's only about Israel. Well, guess what? Everybody had a law. If you go to Romans 5, sin ruled from Adam to Moses. Like, y'all forget about that. So how's sin going to rule if this sin was only coming from the law? Because everybody has a law. If you read the end of I don't know, Acts, you have all these, especially Acts 19, you have Gentiles that have courts and, things decide. And as I say, Romans 2 and Romans 3, the Gentiles have a law of their own through their conscience. So they want to act like there's not any sort of sin for a Gentile. But guess what? Guess where you see Gentiles? Oh, spaghetti. Oh, it was in John 19. Guess who? It says in Acts 4, turned him over to the Gentiles. Well, he was turned over to the Gentiles, and guess who put the spear in his side, where the water and blood come out in John 19? It was a Gentile, and so this Gentile, as we see in other Gentiles in Luke, you say, only say the word, my servant shall be healed. The centurion, my servant shall be healed, Gentile. And the Syrophoenician women, they talk about Elisha and Elijah and how they only went, to certain people. And so, what I want to say about that was, oh yeah, so the one that pierced them, when we look at John 19:37, it's they will look at who they pierced. Well, that's Zechariah 12:10. And so so that they're fulfilled, as I say in Acts and John and Matthew, often this kind of verbiage, and so they're fulfilled. So to fulfill this scripture, and a lot of people want to come act like nothing's really getting fulfilled. It's all what's going to happen, because they can only see the physical. Well, don't come with observation, and his kingdom is not of this world, and so on and so forth. So, to make a long story short, I wanted to say, well, let's go to Matthew 4. So Matthew 4, this is when he was tempted in the desert, and so when it come to the desert, this is the wilderness, and the wilderness is something that Israel went through. They call it Midbar, and so when they go through, when Jesus went through the wilderness, it's that the Spirit told them to go through the wilderness, and that the Spirit, like brought him there to beat Satan, to defeat Satan, to teach us how to defeat Satan. So he was led by the Spirit into the wilderness, and this is Matthew written from a Jewish perspective, because before I get into this, I got to explain the sort of where it all come from. So when we have the Jewish perspective, it comes from not Zoroastrianism, so it is Persian in as much as they had come from the decree of Cyrus, so that and Nehemiah was like a servant or something of Xerxes or whatever it was. It's not really clear when you use pseudonyms and everything, but that Judaism, like, so for instance, the Pharisees. Well, the Pharisees, as we look through Scripture, they were starting to supplant the Sadducees, but the Sadducees had the king caboodle of the seats of the Sanhedrin. So as the Herods came into power, because they were favored by Rome, so this is a late date kind of that Rome would be up in the, because back, if you go back to when the so-called Bible was supposed to take place, Rome was just part of Greece, and so this new Rome, the Roman Empire, which is after the Roman Republic, this new Rome after Julius Caesar and all that, they had, and maybe it was right before that. Yeah, it was right before that. So it was like 63 BC, where Pompey had taken the land, and so over time, as Herod's getting power, there is no Judea, there's no Israel, there's like Samaria, there's different names of. So when Matthew say Jesus went back to Israel, this is the only time we see Israel as talking about a place, and even then, isn't even talking about a place. Maybe he's talking about the people even then. But Matthew is really into a sort of Jewish fulfillment, but it's actually probably one of the latest written ones, and it's probably one of the, sorry to say, most rewritten texts. And so when you read the Dead Sea Scrolls, you can see that most of the Old Testament is rewritten. Like that. Hey, Tony Ted, what's going on, man? The Dead Sea Scrolls, they have variations. There's lots of variations, and so somebody had put me on blast that I was saying that they were all Greek. The Dead Sea Scrolls were all Greek. Not just Cave 7, because they got lots of Aramaic and Hebrew and Samaritan and different languages in the Dead Sea Scroll, but not that much Greek. But what I was trying to say was that it's from the Greek era, and so the Greek era would be the intertestamental period, and the intertestamental period, people get it twisted. They'll say, well, if it was written in the Greek era, it wasn't written at the same time as the other ones. Well, that's not really how you look at it, because the ones before the Greek era were not written. They were oral law. And so even Ezra didn't really have, this, like lots of writings. I just can't even imagine if the Babylonians had taken all the gold and everything and these people are walking all these long distances. They were preserving these scrolls. And so I think they even admit that it was oral tradition, but way to draw the line, because you have back then, you don't really have a canon. So if you look at the Dead Sea Scrolls, there's not really a canon. And so when you go to call them Essenes, that's not really accurate. John the Baptist wasn't down there. John the Baptist was up by Galilee, and where the Israelites are telling you to get baptized is downriver, which is their sewage. And so you don't really want to believe them where they say this is where John was. And the scenes, if John isn't a scene, these aren't the Qumran, because the Qumran were much less. Where the Qumran were influenced by the Pharisees a little bit, and so I'm sorry, the Essenes were influenced by the Pharisees. This is something a lot of people miss about Jesus, because he was so against the Pharisees. They would say, they get you to think that he was against everything they taught. Well, the Pharisees is where we get the idea of this kind of teacher, this kind of resurrection. A lot of things, even the scriptures, like the idea that all this existed before then is not really accurate, because there's often, if you look at Daniel, there's such heavy prophecy to the detail of Greek era that it's not really possible this could have been prophesized. Like, thank you so much, I appreciate it. When it comes to the Greek era, it's not really possible that they would have this. And the Hebrew, like if you do paleography, this Hebrew that they say that didn't even exist back then, the Phoenician, which is actually closer to the Greek, in a lot of ways, was the original language. And so what happened with the Hasmoneans was that they wanted to get Greek gone. They were against Greek, and so they had opposed the Greeks, and there was a war. And so that's, well, if you look at Maccabees, this is a lot of what Daniel was talking about. Like, so at the beginning of this time, they thought, this would be the kingdom that would not have no end, and this would be the Messianic era, and so this would be the fulfillment of what Ezekiel was saying. And so when the Pharisees took over, and the Herodians, especially, which preceded the Pharisees taking over, because the Pharisees took over after Paul, so maybe 100 years later, but it was a slowly replacing with the oral law. And so the oral law come from the Pharisees, that's the Parthians. And so the Parthians, before that they were the Sassanids and the Achaemenids, and this is where the Zoroastrianism comes from, and this is where the dualism comes from. But the Jewish people didn't have dualism. What they had was monotheism. So when you read Zechariah and say Satan, was the accuser, and you read Job 1 and say Satan is the accuser, this is part of God's nature. God was all these different parts. It was Elohim, all these different, let's say, persons. And so when you have the accuser person, that's part of his nature. So he tells God to put his hand on Job, for instance, or to, accuse Yehoshua, who is the Aaronic Messiah, and then you have the Davidic Messiah, who is Zerubbabel. And so this is something that was maybe even the beginning of millennium. If you read Second Esdras, the millennium was 400 years, and if you read Zoroastrianism, there's similar millennial concepts, and same with Greek theology and history. So the millennial is this term that people are waiting for, and they were waiting for it to first get bad, then it would get good. Well, if it's going to first get bad, then it's going to get good, and the usher in the millennium with a piece like, let's say, Isaiah 11 or something, you would have to, maybe have a battle or something. And so this would be reminiscent of David. David had conquered like, let's say, Damascus and Arabia and Edom and Samaria and like all these different places. And so David, as Christians would understand him as a certain type, of him that would come, which would be the Messiah. But when I read the Old Testament, Christians that have you believe that there was like it was all messianic future, like it was all just pointing directly to Jesus. Well, there's like lots of different messiahs. There's Cyrus, who was a Gentile, but he was Semitic, and Gentile, more specifically, could mean in certain contexts Western. So as time was going on, this battle between North and South, by the time of Josiah, where supposedly Pharaoh Necho had killed Josiah at the Armageddon and Megiddo, that's where we get that term. This became a battle of East and West, and you see this in Daniel. You see this goat running from the west and trampling everything, and this is what happened with Daniel or not Daniel, Alexander. So Alexander was a young man who had gone from the west and took over all of Asia. But what happened is he didn't take over like East Asia beyond the Himalayas, because that was beyond there, and he didn't take up beyond the steeps. The Caucasus Mountains was where like the Scythians and stuff. But as Paul said, I owe a debt to the Scythians. That's probably where the Pharisees, originally came from, the Tartars, or like if you go back far, far, far enough, maybe it was Kuwait or whatever they say it is. Regardless, it was to the northeast, and so Alexander, he had taken out the land of that kind of known world, but it wasn't like there wasn't any other world. Like they knew that on the other side of the mountains there probably was some people, and there's probably like Transylvania or different parts of even Europe that he didn't even go to. And so when he had conquered that, that's because he took over the Persians, and this was right after the Trojan War and everything. And so when he took over the Persians, he inherited all that empire, and so this idea of the Semitic Empire, because if you read, Cyrus was called the Mede, and Darius, the Mede is Cyrus, and so because Darius means king in Persian, and so when they had taken over this empire, they had or when the Greeks had, this is you see this all over, like Tobit. Tobit would talk about, the days of Assyria are going to fall, and flee to Media, and so eventually Media fell, and so on and so forth. You see Assyria falling in the story of Judith, but and this is code for even Daniel, or not Daniel, Alexander, because they use this code a lot, because a lot of even this talk about David could even have been Herod, because the Bible's written in Herodian times, and so even the Dead Sea Scrolls written in Herodian times. It wasn't that these people were fleeing the Babylonians, and that's why they're in the Dead Sea, but that might have happened because that's probably why Jerusalem got famous in the first place, because it was so far to the south towards the Dead Sea, which already at that point had been associated with Sodom and Gomorrah, like that almost brimstone had come down and destroyed all the vegetation. And so not the Judean hills, there's some nice parts up towards the north, but as you get closer to that, that's probably where people did flee. That probably Nebuchadnezzar took over all the Bedouin areas in the desert and more of Africa, but the Syrians took over everything that they wanted that was kind of important, and so really evidence would suggest that Josiah was even like an Assyrian, that he's, my connection's not very good. I'm just going to end this video. I'm getting really hungry anyways. All right, see ya.